Stay on the clock. Sorry. Good morning, everyone. A warm welcome to the 19th meeting of the Constitution Europe External Affairs and Culture in 2025. We have one agenda item this morning, evidence from the Cabinet Secretary on the EU-UK Summit, and we're joined in the room by Angus Robertson, Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, External Affairs and Culture, and Benjamin Graham, Head of Negotiating Strategy at the Scottish Government. And a warm welcome to you both, and can I invite Mr Robertson for you to make a few opening remarks.
And a very good morning to you, and it's a pleasure to join you in a public session of your committee's deliberations. And thanks for asking me to come back following the publication of the committee's second report into the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and I'm happy to address questions arising from the report, and will provide a general update on UK-EU relations in accordance with our working arrangements, which were agreed in 2024. Let me start with the UK-EU Summit, which was held on the 19th of May, and repeat here the words of the EU Commission's President Ursula von der Leyen in welcoming the agreement, where she said, and I quote, "We are friends, we are Europeans, we are very like-minded, we share the same interests and the same values," and the Scottish Government is of the same view. We welcome all attempts to rebuild relations with the EU at this critical moment in international affairs and embrace the progress made. Indeed, the Scottish Government wants both parties to go further and faster in their reset, implementing the most ambitious package of measures possible. But this deal will only bring small relief to the damage caused by the Westminster Government, and whilst the UK Government congratulates itself on staying within its red lines of not rejoining the single market, not rejoining the customs union, and remaining against the free movement of people, it is these very red lines that remain deeply damaging to Scotland. The Scottish Government maintains a much more ambitious vision for Scotland's relationship with Europe, and that, of course, is full membership. So, firstly, let me welcome important elements of the agreement. The Defence and Security Partnership is urgently necessary for the safety of our continent and will allow Scotland's defence capacities to play their part. Many other parts of the agreement broadly align with the policy positions that we shared with the UK Government through position papers published in the last 12 months. The Scottish agriculture, food and drink sector should be able to export their products without going through the checks imposed by Brexit. Young people in Scotland should be able to study, work and live in the rest of Europe, and we in turn can welcome EU citizens here. And closer cooperation on energy should allow us to benefit from greener energy and confront, together with our European neighbours, the shared challenges of climate change. But it's urgent that these initiatives are negotiated, agreed and delivered quickly, and we will give all the support that we can towards their rapid conclusion. And whilst we offer our support, we need the UK Government to engage better with Scottish interests and this Government. We're deeply disappointed that the UK Government did not share draft texts with the Scottish Government, or indeed any other devolved government before the summit. The fact the fisheries agreement was reached without any notice to us, much less any involvement, is testament enough. Given the sheer number of devolved responsibilities involved, the Scottish Government must be more closely involved and included in forthcoming talks, not least to protect the role of the Scottish Parliament. The intergovernmental structures must be tested this year, tested by their continuous operation and by meaningful engagement. To finish, let me address the committee's second report into the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. I welcome the report, and I specifically note your recommendations on the creation of a music export office. This matches the undertaking that we've given in our international culture strategy to support those working in the cultural sector to realise the full potential of international activity. And a forthcoming feasibility study will inform how we can best support international cultural activity and overcome challenges for those working in the sector. And I'll be happy to provide further updates as we make progress on this, and will happily address wider questions from the committee. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. In your letter to us, you said that all parties should focus on rapid implementation to deliver at pace the benefits signalled at the summit. What is your understanding of the timetable from implementation, and has that been discussed with the Scottish Government at all? I'm sure the committee knows this, but much
of the agreement that was reached between the United Kingdom government and the European Union was high-level agreement in principle, and the details of the agreement have in significant part not been agreed yet. So our understanding, actually from the European Union, it's the European Union's ambassador to the United Kingdom told us this, as opposed to the United Kingdom government telling us this, the negotiating mandates for these detailed discussions are hoped to be agreed for the European Union by the summer break. What the timetable is for the UK's negotiating mandate is not clear to the Scottish Government. And the process by which those negotiations then might take place and the involvement of devolved administrations who have significant locus in these issues is also not clear to the Scottish Government. Your question about implementation would be something that would follow the detail of an agreement, because otherwise there's nothing to implement beyond the high-level agreement. There shall be an SPS agreement. There will be progress made on Erasmus Plus and so on and so on. The details of those have not been agreed, but they will be. And one of the other things that was pointed out to us from the European Union side, again, rather than the UK side, is that there will be another UK-EU summit next year. So the understanding is that there has been a summit and an agreement this year, that there will be negotiations that will begin this year, and one would imagine that significant progress on the detail should be made by next year's summit. That, convener, is the best that I can, in significant part, guess, because that has not been made clear to us from the United Kingdom government about how they expect this to progress in detail.
Cabinet Secretary, one of the concerns the committee had about the implementation of the TCA is that the borders on the EU side had been established and checks were made for importing goods from the UK to Europe, but the checks on this side had yet to be implemented in full. In that negotiation period, is it your understanding that the EU will be applying the TCA as it is at the moment to goods coming in?
So, firstly, dealing with the known knowns, I think you're absolutely right to point out that the context of an SPS agreement, so an agri-foods and veterinary agreement, which will have a significant impact in particular on the food and drink sector, which is so important to the Scottish economy, that one of the reasons why this is so important, I think, to the sector here is that when such an agreement is in place, it will obviate the requirements for a significant part of border checks, which the UK has not yet implemented. The last UK government did not implement them and put things back, and the current UK government has not yet implemented those checks. So, were they to do so, this would add on delays and problems, which, as we know, have already caused significant challenge, not least in the agriculture and food sector, where live products, shellfish, for example, which are very significant export to the continental European market, any delays are very problematic. And that's one of the big prizes of having what I prefer to call an agriculture and food agreement, an SPS agreement, and why we lobbied the UK government very hard for there to be one. I cannot imagine that the UK government would wish to introduce border checks before such an agreement would be reached, for the reasons that I've just outlined. But I have had no information about what plans the UK government has in terms of the timing, sequencing or treatment of that as an issue. But perhaps Mr Graham sitting next to me, it'll come on automatically. We'll have something to update the committee on.
Just thank you, CapSec. And just to note, Convener, that the border target operating model process, which is in implementation as we're going through the summit negotiations, that as I understand it, there's internal UK process potentially to pause that implementation process of BTOM, and then that will allow negotiations on the SPS agreement, and the SPS agreement, when implemented, will obviate many of the checks that BTOM would put in place. So I know that agriculture ministers and officials are confirming that as of last week, that it's possible to rubber stamp and pause the BTOM process, and then focus shifts to the summit.
About what's happening here, and what I'm interested in is if that unequal playing field, as it's been described by our importers to the EU, is likely to remain during that negotiation process up to the point where the detail of what's been agreed in principle is done.
It would appear so, but I would hope that would encourage everybody involved in the process with goodwill to do so as quickly as possible. I mean, this is not a straightforward process. It has to be acknowledged. But we, the Scottish Government, agree that an SPS agreement would be very welcome. The UK Government agrees that this would be a very welcome agreement, and the European Union and its member states agree that this would be a very welcome agreement. Their issues will be thrown up as part of the process. So it will probably be knowledge to the committee that there are certain products that are produced in Scotland where their treatment will be germane to SPS negotiations. So, for example, the production of oats in Scotland and how that would go forward in an SPS context is something that has been highlighted to the Scottish Government from the sector. It's something that we have raised with the UK Government, who say that they have heard that. The detail of that will need to be worked through, but we are beginning to move beyond the principle that there should be an agricultural and food agreement to the details of how one could operate. But to your point about how long will the current system or the status quo continuing, the non-implementation of additional border checks, which the UK would have to do were it not for an SPS agreement, I think gives everybody an incentive to try and reach an agreement. And this will be to the benefit of the agriculture food sector in Scotland, the rest of the UK and European Union member states. And it is also of very particular issue, of very particular interest in Northern Ireland, because it will simplify some of the agreements that have been made as part of the Windsor framework, with Northern Ireland effectively being part of the single European market and being part of the United Kingdom single market at the same time.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'm going to move to questions. I'll bring in Mr Brown and then Mr Stewart.
Thanks very much, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. It's unfortunate, really, because there's so many important things going on in terms of the TCA and the agreement the UK government's reached. So, whether it's musicians, the cultural connections, whether it's different sectors, all sorts of things which are very important to this committee. But we really have to come back to process. And in particular, I want to discuss fishing. Now, my understanding is that the Scottish Government's position is that they were not consulted in any way, shape or form on the issue or the outcome that eventuated, if you like, on fishing, or in fact on the agreement itself, the overall agreement, which is really quite appalling. Other European countries seem to manage to take a much more inclusive approach. I understand very recently from the UK government that they did not initiate any fishing discussions, although they do say they had engagement with fishing industries, but they did not initiate any fishing discussions. And you can imagine, had they done so and said what they were about to do, what the reaction would have been. However, the UK government's position now is to say it's a great deal. Fishing is very happy. The dissonance between what the UK government is saying and what fishing are saying seems to be huge. So I just wonder, just to confirm for us, what involvement did the UK government give to the Scottish government in terms of, first of all, the likely decision on fishing? And we've heard from other sources, which we're not able to mention, that that part of the deal was done essentially long before they got to a UK agreement deal, or it was understood to be done. So what discussions did the UK government have with the Scottish government and, as you understand it, the fishing industry interests on that deal?
Convener, with your indulgence, your question will necessitate quite a long answer to give the committee the full detail that I imagine Mr Brown and colleagues want. So firstly, on process, the committee is aware that relations between the Scottish Government and other devolved administrations in the UK Government happens in the space of intergovernmental relations and interministerial meetings, which see ministers with the same or similar responsibilities supposed to meet regularly to discuss matters of mutual or shared sovereignty, areas which there is devolved decision-making where there is a UK locus and vice versa. That's the theory. And we had a commitment from the UK government that the reset that was much talked about was not just in relation to the European Union, but was also in relation to devolved administrations. And the committee, because I've come here regularly to give evidence, Convener, is well aware of the very difficult circumstances that we operated on in the intergovernmental relations space with the last UK government, where it did not function properly, where meetings didn't take place, where discussions weren't held, where agreements were just reached, and the Sewell Convention was increasingly being disregarded as a matter of course. So, when we had a new UK government in, talking about a reset, of doing things differently, we communicated very strongly, directly to the Prime Minister, downwards, and have said so repeatedly in public how much we welcome that. That with that public declaration of doing things differently, better, the way it should be, that this would be to everybody's advantage. And thus far, or until the European Union agreement process, I would have said that there would most certainly have been a different atmospheric in the conversations that would take place, that did take place, with every time there was a meeting, a repeating from UK ministerial sides of this discussion is within the context of a reset. We really want to have better relations, and that matters to us as a UK government. And so then we move forward to this particular process in relation to the EU agreement and related issues, and the reality of how things then actually worked, to me, did not match the rhetoric of a reset in relations. Now, what do I mean by that? On the process, specifically in the run-up to the EU-UK agreement, I held 2 meetings with my opposite number in the Cabinet Office, Nick Thomas-Symonds. Very positive mood and language in both of those meetings, one remotely and one with Nick Thomas-Symonds coming to Edinburgh, where we were joined by the Welsh Government and the Northern Irish First Minister and Deputy First Minister online. And in the first meeting, He was able to say what the UK government's priorities in the forthcoming discussions and agreement were. And I was able to say, here are the Scottish Government's priorities, and there's significant agreement that we would wish, an SPS agreement, that we would wish reassociation to Erasmus Plus, that we wanted a youth mobility agreement, that we wanted energy agreement, that we wanted judicial cooperation. So, sorry, and incidentally also the rejoining of Creative Europe. And the UK government was able to say, we hear your priorities loud and clear, and we will take those into our conversations. There are no details that I can update you on, because this is an ongoing matter, and I will be meeting with Mr Sefcovic and other colleagues, and we will be discussing all of that. That took place on the 30th of April this year. 2 weeks later, just 2 weeks later, was the meeting which involved Welsh and Northern Irish colleagues. This is at a time where, in the interim, the discussions had been taking place with European interlocutors. Why do we know that? Because we speak to European colleagues as well as the UK government. So we know that in Brussels, the member states were looking at documentation of what the UK, of what the European Union's mandate, but also where progress was being made. They were seeing 27 EU ambassadors were seeing documentation. And in the meeting with Nick Thomas-Symonds, I raised this. I said, we have received no documentation. We are not aware of how negotiations have been progressing. The European Union is able to do it with the inclusion of 27 member states to share documentation and update on things. Please, can you share the documentation before final agreement? And he said that he would take that away. He didn't say no. He said it wasn't normal custom and practice. I said it should be. But he said that he would take that away from that meeting and have a think about that. That was prior to the weekend summit, where the agreement was then signed off. I was very intrigued by something you said there, Mr. Brown, where you shared with the committee and with me that you have been told that on fisheries, that this was, that what I've written down here was done long before the UK-EU agreement was signed off.
Should be careful with words here. My understanding from a meeting we held last week, and I'll not go into the details of the meeting, was that part of it, the fisheries part of it, was understood on both sides, what was likely to happen long before they got down to... It was almost a precursor for the agreement. Okay. I think the word precursor might have been used, in fact.
Yeah. So my understanding is that the agreement around rollover on fisheries and its length was not finalised before the weekend, and indeed it was raised on the weekend that the agreement was reached. How do we know that? We know that from discussions in Brussels, not from the UK government. But I'll continue in my explaining the context of the process, which I do think is very important. So, at the meeting on the 12th of May, where Nick Thomas-Symonds was speaking to the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish governments to say that we, the UK government, are making progress in all of these areas, I and colleagues were able to say, and did, that we would wish not just to have a readout without detail and without documentation, that we would wish to have detail and documentation. Until I raised it, the word fisheries was not mentioned from the UK government. So there was a readout of what would constitute part of an EU-UK agreement at a summit, but it was only when I asked, after a lengthy introduction and scene setting from the UK government, which did not mention fishing, that I asked, what is the UK government's position? And to say I had an elliptical reply is an understatement. There was no detail. There was euphemisms used about stability There was no mention of rollover or length of time that there should be such a thing. And I think, you know, my position on that is it's just not. That is not a reset. That is not a proper relationship. That is not respectful. That is not how we should do business. Full stop. Full stop. When the United Kingdom was in the European Union, there were Scottish Government officials and officials from the SFF and others in Brussels sitting in rooms where one was able to inform the process about agreements that were being reached. Documentation was being shared, and there was a conversation about process. In this agreement, there was not. And in terms of other issues, we were talking in principal terms of we wish the UK to rejoin Erasmus+, we wish the UK to reassociate with Creative Europe, and then we literally had the summit, an agreement, and a readout. We've agreed this, and then I would say something like, what happened to Creative Europe? And the answer I got was, well, that just didn't happen. To which I'm not... we are not clear. Why did it not happen? Did it not happen because the UK tried and it didn't happen? Did the European Union side bring it up and the UK said no? We don't know. So the process is not working properly. The substance, in significant part, is welcome. And it is important that we understand both of those to make sure that when things are perhaps more challenging, that the process is robust enough to get one through all of that. And this point I have made to the UK government subsequently as well. Process does matter, and keeping people in the dark and telling people after the event. Sorry, there's an additional fact which I think I should add, because no doubt there'll be a follow-up question in relation to this. As part of the inter-ministerial relations between the devolved administrations and the UK government, in important policy areas, Mr Brown raised fishing. These are things that in the normal run of events should have been discussed at the interministerial group involving Scotland's Agriculture and Fisheries Minister and the DEFRA Minister from the UK government. The last 3 meetings of that in the run-up to the agreement were cancelled, all by the UK side. So there was not a substantive meeting on that. On culture, the last IMG took place in May 2024, and since then further meetings have been delayed repeatedly, so no discussion was possible in the run-up to the summit on Creative Europe and on the mobility of touring artists.
Thought as well, but I just think I'm taking up more time and as other members want to come in. So I did have a second question, but we'll come back to it if we've got time at the end.
Thank you, Mr Brown. If we could be succinct in answers and questions, that would be very helpful. So I bring in Mr Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. This event was hailed as a massive success by the UK government. I think the Prime Minister indicated that Britain was back in business with the EU. That was one of the comments that were made. And the reset, as we already heard, had huge difficulties and tensions with fishery, and that you've gone into, and I thank you for that. But we have also heard that there are opportunities when it comes to defence and security, food and drink, and energy cooperation. But can I ask that these are still just opportunities rather than agreements, because the member states still have to endorse or ratify some of these to make sure that becomes the case. So what meaningful engagement would we expect from the Scottish Government and the UK Government on the food and drink, the energy cooperation and the defence and security to be going forward? You've already explained this morning about some of the difficulties you've encountered when it came to fisheries. But if there's a reset on these 3 areas that gives Scotland an opportunity, what is that opportunity and what kind of meaningful negotiation and engagement would you expect as the Scottish Government from that?
Well, I would hope nothing less than European Union member states have in relation to the European Union institutions themselves. So, as I outlined, the European Union is currently arranging its negotiating mandate that involves the EU institutions, so the Commission and the Council, and the EU member states. I would expect that if there had been a reset and one was wishing to make sure that the devolved administrations were fully part of the process, so that one had the best input and outputs of the detail of the agreement that we're now trying to reach, one would have the same sort of arrangement. I'm unaware of any arrangement or any formalised structure that will take this forward whatsoever. So that does not fill me with confidence, given what I've just said thus far. We will be doing everything that we can. It doesn't take a constitutional lawyer to understand that agriculture and fisheries, youth-related issues including education and judicial cooperation, and aspects of energy are matters where the Scottish Government has a really strong locus, and the Scottish Parliament has a really important job in making sure that the Scottish Government is doing everything that it should do to further the interests of the Scottish people in relation to this agreement. Now, we are going to do this. We're going to try and do it. But as you have heard from my initial answer to the process point, I am deeply frustrated by the fact that it is not working as it should. Am I encouraging the UK government to listen very closely, to live up to its rhetoric on reset, to use the mechanisms that they have agreed to on intergovernmental relations, and that these processes are meaningful and are not just readouts of the UK government's priorities and positions, that they genuinely take on board different priorities. I can tell you why that's important, and I can give you a very real example, and no doubt you have turned some attention to this. Since the EU-UK agreement, the Scottish Government was approached by the UK Government, who wished to deal with a challenge in relation to labelling in Northern Ireland. And that necessitated very, very quick decisions involving the Scottish Government ceding devolved sovereignty on a devolved issue to find a solution that we did not think was the best outcome in a process which then has led to a rushed process in the Scottish Parliament in relation to the Parliament's ability to scrutinise that process. And I said to UK ministers as part of those discussions, this is another example of the fact that process is not working. Because had the interministerial groups involving DEFRA and the Scottish Government been taking place, this could have been resolved weeks, if not months ago. And it's just another example of the process is not working properly. We want it to work. We are happy to meet, to share our views on the different subjects. I've talked about a potential requirement for derogation in terms of the SPS agreement. No doubt you'll get evidence about why that's important. We're on it. We need to know that the UK government's on it. And the processes are not there. The processes are there in terms of how we should meet formally, but they are not working as they should.
Thank you. Can I let others come in now?
Mr Kerr, did you want to come in?
Yes. So we had a debate on the Thursday before the EU-UK summit. You might remember the debate. You were the government speaker. And that morning's Financial Times had highlighted the fact that the price for Britain's, the ability for Britain to play with the safe £350 billion loans to fund defence was the fishing. the fishing rights. So the TCA rollover, that was the price. And we agreed, I think, that that was an unacceptable point of negotiation given the precarious situation there is in terms of defence and security in Europe. You have rightly pointed out that the concession on fishing, although it might have been made in principle, as Keith Brown says, prior to the morning of the 19th, on the morning of the 19th, the EU said, no agreement unless you give us, I can't remember, is it 12 years? I think it's 12 years. 12 years rollover. That's awful, isn't it? I mean, that's a terrible way to talk about defence and security. Do you still stand by what you said in our exchange in the Chamber about the EU's attitude towards defence and security and fishing rights?
Well, I stand by what I said in the Parliament. I do. I mean, it makes me smile now because Mr. Kerr, of course, would have heard other voices in the Chamber poo-pooing any suggestion that fisheries was being used as a way to get agreement. And it turned out that it was very much a part of making sure that an agreement could be reached. Well, but this is my point, Mr. Kerr. Do we want to do government by newspaper leaks?
Oh, I see.
Is this really how we want to do intergovernmental relations? No, it's not.
To be fair, Cabinet Secretary, I think you've made your point on that issue. I want to make a point about the fact that the EU's approach to this negotiation is very cynical when it comes to particularly the French national interest, when it comes to fishing rights. And I think we agreed on that in the Chamber. I just want to make sure that we were still in agreement on that.
I stand by everything that I said in the Chamber in that debate.
Your letter to us, or to the convener, talks about the SPS agreement, if I may swivel to that. And you rightly, I think, suggest in the second paragraph, progress on the SPS agreement, if realised. If realised. Now, you were very positive earlier about the prospect of that being realised. That might well just be your natural, buoyant optimism speaking. But the reality is that negotiations with the European Union are pretty difficult and sometimes very extended. So, from what you understand, when could we see such... There is no such agreement at the minute. Yeah. I mean, it's all just vague good feelings. When do you think there could realistically be an agreement? Because it looks like, from our conversations in London, the first year, that's between this last summit in May and the next one, is all going to be about SAFE. It's all going to be about defence and security. The EU negotiating positions notoriously take a while. You know that better than most. The idea that they're going to get it done by the end of the summer seems optimistic as well. So when do you think we could realistically be looking at scrutinising a proposed SPS agreement between the UK and the EU?
Yeah, through you, Convener, there's nothing I can add in detail to Mr. Kerr's entirely reasonable question, save that which I outlined before, which was shared from the European Union side with the Scottish Government about the fact that there is going to be an annual summit between the United Kingdom and the European Union is not unhelpful in terms of making sure that there's a focus on making progress with all of these things. It really matters that progress is made on the defence and security side of things, as well as everything else. And I do think that now that the headline agreement in terms of what one expects out of this process, the details still to be worked out, is something that will be progressed this year, I have no doubt. And the fact that
if you're talking about
this is the entire range of what is in the agreement. I expect I expect there to be progress on everything, because if there weren't a willingness to make progress on the points, they wouldn't have been part of the agreement, and nobody has said subsequently to either from the EU side or the UK side that that's not important or there isn't an interest in making these things happen. I think it is a package. And of course, there's different interests from the European Union side and its member states, and then from the UK side. So I would expect there to be progress on all of these things, but you've given me a challenge, Mr Kerr. When do I think this committee will be able to scrutinise the details of that? And I'm not in a position to answer that. But I give the committee the commitment that the next time I meet with the UK government, I will be raising that. When can you expect to see documentation? When will you be able to see text? I just make the point again, we saw no documentation and no text as part of the process in the run-up to the agreement. So I'll be making the point that that is not the way to deal with the Scottish Government or Welsh or Northern Irish colleagues as part of the agreement process. And then in terms of the detail, our committees, our parliaments need to see the detail as soon as possible.
So it could be years off. It could be years off.
I hope not, but I see that Mr Graham, if you allow Mr Graham to give a bit of detail, that might be helpful.
Just to note very briefly, Mr Kerr, the phased process means that we'll go through agreeing mandates between the UK government and the EU, exactly, and we understand, and this is purely from official conversations that I've had, that with the UK government, that the EU does want to move at pace on this, and I've heard timelines of 18 months to 2 years suggested.
For the SBS?
Would be around the SBS agreement. That would be working out what that would consist of, and then after that it would be a case of implementing it. So it's that phased process, and we would be able to update along the course of that in terms of as we make progress on that. Because
the UK defence sector is an enormous component of the total European defence sector, my understanding is that FAST will be prioritised. That is what will be approached at pace, and something will be unveiled next year that will allow Britain some role, some part in FAST. But what I'm interested in, and that's why I'm asking about SBS and all the other aspects of this so-called agreement. I'm not convinced it's an agreement. It's 3 documents where there's lots of lovely aspirations set out in nice text. But my question to you is, you're a long-term EU file. You're a close observer of the EU. Is it likely to be nothing is agreed until everything's agreed? Or do you foresee us, and I think this would be against what we know the European Union tends to operate like, taking a sequential approach to all the different elements that are listed, particularly in the Common Understanding document?
Yeah. I think that's a known unknown at the moment, to answer your question, Mr. Kerr. It's an entirely reasonable question. I would just say that I do think it is in everybody's interest to make progress on all of these things as quickly as we can. The threat to us all in Europe is very real. Yeah. The requirement to have everything at the disposal of our armed forces to do the job that they require is a priority for everybody. And similarly, it matters for our economy and all of the other areas of the potential agreement that these proceed at pace. But I don't think there is clarity yet as to whether there will be a different delivery date, if you want to call it that, to what Mr. Kerr quite rightly points out are 3 distinct parts of what emerged from the UK-EU summit. And as soon as we have any clarity on that, I will be content to share that with the committee.
Yeah, I think the sense on the continent is of the more imminent threat of war. And therefore it's understandable that the European Union will want to press ahead, and rightly so, with the British inclusion in SAFE as a third country. On the SPS, we could have a longer session, I'm sure, but I don't think there's an appetite today for that. On the SPS, there are 2 models of that the EU have in existence on a proper SPS agreement. One's with Switzerland, which has been going since 1999, where there's dynamic alignment. And the other is with New Zealand. And the New Zealand SPS agreement is even older, and it recognises the equivalence of sanitary measures, and it minimises physical checks and allows streamlined certification, something that would be highly desirable as well. I hope you would agree with that. Of the 2 models that exist, and I know that the argument will be there's a third model because Britain is in a different category, but there are 2 existing off-the-shelf models that exist. I think what you say in your letter to the committee convener is that you would favour dynamic alignment.
Well, that's been agreed by the United Kingdom government.
Well, yes, but the negotiation, the full extent of the negotiation has even begun, and the EU's negotiating.
I very much think, Mr Kerr, that unless the United Kingdom had agreed in terms of the headline agreement, the dynamic alignment was the bit that it wouldn't have passed go.
The problem with this is, and you rightly get exercised about the rights and powers of this Parliament under the devolution settlement. The problem with dynamic alignment is that we're back into the position where we were before we left the European Union. Britain will have, but worse, because Britain will have no role other than a third-party consultation prior to any new directives or regulations, and we will have no choice. We'll have no choice in accepting those. Now, that if the UK government took that line as its general approach in terms of how it governs, and you would object to that very strongly, and when it does, you object very strongly, why do you not object to such an arrangement with the European Union?
I'm sure, convener, you would wish me to stick within the requirements of this particular evidence session, but what I would say to Mr Kerr is there is a very elegant solution to the conundrum that he highlights, which is that just like 27 nations that sit at the top table in the Council of Ministers, nominating a commissioner, having members of the European Parliament, the best solution to Scotland's future in optimal relations with the European Union is to be a member state.
You're doing a marvellous job at deflection. My last...
Can I
have one last question, very quickly?
Well, Mr Brown gave up his right to
I know
a
he did,
question,
and
so
I'm
I'll come
mindful
back to you after that.
All right, okay.
Mr Harvey.
Thank you very much, convener. Good morning. I wanted to focus on what you described about the intergovernmental process. And I think what you fairly bluntly described as a failure of intergovernmental process. Look, it's probably inevitable that those who are more sympathetic to devolution or to Scottish independence are going to place more of the blame for that failure on the UK government. Those who are much more concerned about British independence and the sovereignty of the British state would place more of the blame on the Scottish government. But I'd like to see if we can find a way to break through that, because just continually saying there's a logjam and a failure of intergovernmental process leaves us kind of stuck. So I'm wondering what you think the Scottish Government can do to try and break through that. For example, are you considering a public consultation? Would there be scope for a joint public consultation with the Welsh Government, for example, who might not agree on everything, but could lay out the options publicly for how these relationships should work better? Not only comparing what's happening at the moment with what happened under previous iterations of devolution, what happened under the EU membership, but also what happens in other EU countries that have distributed forms of government. You'll recall, for example, the government of the region of Wallonia has regularly been able to challenge decisions that the Belgian government wanted to make, whether on CETA or on Brexit legislation. There'll be other European governments that have multi-level or multi-tier forms of government where these issues are debated and agreed in a different way, in a more successful way than what you've described as a failed process. Would a public consultation setting out the options for what could be improved help to move things along if the UK government isn't willing to make fundamental changes?
So, the good news is that I don't actually think that one, in a devolved context, needs to reinvent the wheel. We had a review of intergovernmental relations, and structures that were looked into in great detail in this committee and elsewhere were broadly welcomed, and everybody declared their willingness to make these structures work. I think since the incoming UK government, there has been a difference in tone, as in an avowal that the process processes are there and that they should work, and that one wishes to have good relations with devolved administrations. And as is the nature of these things within government, there are some bits of the UK government that are better than others in understanding why these things matter and why these intergovernmental processes should be prioritised. And I think a reasonable time has now elapsed from a new government taking office to understanding what it is that they're wanting to do and how they are going to do it and what processes are in place. And I think we've now moved beyond what at the start are just very general declarations of willingness to make things work and reset and doing things better. And we're now at the point of, are the meetings taking place? Are they discussing substance? And so on. Now, public consultation. Well, I mean, I would have thought, in terms of public, I mean, not for me to do the job of a committee, but you know, you take evidence in public involving people from the UK government. Okay, so I would imagine that a UK government saying that it's in favour of a reset and being transparent, that they would give evidence in public to a committee like this to explain how they are doing things. And then the record would show an explanation of why systemically we are dealing with the cancellation of intergovernmental relations meetings in advance of important stuff. Now, if the answers to those sort of closed questions are unsatisfactory, or the assurances that have been given in public about how things are going to be different are not actually being delivered, I would not rule out anything about trying to help things get better. Now, for the committee record, I would wish everybody to understand this isn't just the position of the Scottish Government. This is a concern that is shared by colleagues in the Welsh Labour Party.
Yeah.
And it is shared by a Sinn Féin First Minister of Northern Ireland and a Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland from the Democratic Unionist Party. So we do not find ourselves alone in this situation. And if things don't change, we are going to have to look closely at how we make that change.
Can I just press you a little bit further, though, on what things changing actually requires? The hope that you've expressed about things working better, about relationships working better, meetings working better, you know, I would share that even in the current framework, that we would hope UK ministers are willing to come and talk to Scottish Parliament committees on the record and give us evidence. Our efforts have not met with success so far to achieve that, but I hope that changes. But surely the Scottish Government's position has to be that structural change is required in order to give not just the current UK government, but any future UK government a requirement to make that relationship work. It cannot rely on the goodwill of individual ministers of the government of the day, either in Scotland or in London or elsewhere, to make that relationship work. It has to be a structural requirement, otherwise they won't have an incentive to do so.
So I totally agree with Mr. Harvey. We should expect to have good working relations all of the time as a matter of course. One might disagree about things, of course, have different priorities, of course. But where there is a temptation to not have to explain oneself to others, whether that's parliaments or other governments, unfortunately, that route is being chosen by others. Mr. Harvey mentioned Wallonia. It's a very interesting case in point, because unlike the UK, Wallonia and Flanders have devolved rights in relation to treaties. Yeah. And we do not here, notwithstanding the fact some people keep on talking about the Scottish devolution settlement being amongst the strongest in the world. There's a very good example where it is not. And as a result of treaty involvement of both Wallonia and Flanders, it means that the Belgian federal government has to work as well as it can with Wallonia and Flanders, because it has to. And this is the challenge that we've got, where in some areas we operate on the basis of conventions, a la Soule, which is why we're having discussions about should that not be on a statutory basis. At some point, no doubt, Convener, you will want to ask what progress has been made in terms of the UK government's approach to the Soule Convention, a memorandum of understanding that was promised on that. Happy to come back at any stage, Convener, would you wish to discuss that. But to Mr Harvey's point, structural change, yes.
It was raised at the IPF last week, which myself and Mr Stewart attended.
So I agree with Mr Harvey. I think there are structural changes within a devolved context, because I don't believe that devolved governance is the optimal solution for Scotland's governance. But I agree that unless there is a requirement for the UK government to have better intergovernmental relations, sadly, too often it just isn't a priority, and that's not good enough.
Thank you.
You made a very lengthy contribution earlier in answer to Mr Brown, where you listed a number of complaints and about the UK government keeping the Scottish government in the dark over the discussions with the European Union. You did say one thing that I thought was very, very interesting. You said that the Scottish government was talking to the European Union during the negotiations. In the interest of transparency, could you set out why the Scottish government was doing that, what form that took, what information was shared by the Scottish government to the European Union during those discussions?
So the Scottish Government has, as Mr Bibby knows, an office in Brussels.
Yeah, well aware.
And the officials who work in the Scottish Government office speak with the UK mission to the European Union, and as is the way Brussels works, speaks with officials from right across the institutions. As a matter of course, that is what all representative offices do in Brussels. And it is through those channels that one often hears about where progress is being made. And is that the optimal way of finding out about progress of negotiating? No, it's not. It's not. And I'm sorry that that was the extent of the information that we had, because that was not being shared with us from the UK government.
That last bit wasn't my question. In the interest of transparency, will you publish the discussions that were happening between?
Sorry, there were no formal discussions between the Scottish Government and any member state of the European Union or any individual institution. That that officials from representative offices and embassies talk to one another about progress that's been made, or what does one understand, is the way that the civil service talk to one another, and it's not a matter of common practice that one has formal records of discussions in passing between officials. That's not the way that these things operate, and Mr Bibby knows that to be the case.
Well, I think it was just you kind of maybe sounded more formal than that when you originally answered Mr Brown. So it was kind of gossip and hearsay. Is that?
Well, it most certainly does not turn out to be gossip and hearsay, because in the conversations that have taken place subsequently, and these are things that are open to the committee, of course, when one is in London and speaking to the European Union's representative office to the UK, one can ask, can't one, about much of this, and it turns out that what I have described is exactly how things progressed, and one might even be able to read about it on the front page of some newspapers as well.
So were the UK government, or are the UK government aware of all the discussions that the Scottish government is having with any officials from EU member states of the EU? You complained about the UK government keeping the Scottish government in the dark in relation to discussions.
No, I think it's really important. I think
it's really important. I can finish my point, Mr Robertson, because you've had plenty of opportunity to speak. Were the UK government aware of all the discussions that the Scottish government were having during the negotiations with the European Union? Were the UK government kept in the dark over the discussions the Scottish government were having?
No, there were no formal discussions between the Scottish Government and Member States of the European
Informal
Union.
discussions.
I said formal discussions.
Informal.
And there's a false equivalence here.
Informal, Mr.
There's a, if I can answer through the chair, which I think is custom and practice here. There's a false equivalence about discussing the formal relations between governments within the United Kingdom, processes involving negotiations with the European Union, and the job that civil servants have in being informed by speaking to other UK civil servants in UK government departments, or indeed meeting with or discussing things in passing with civil servants of other countries in Brussels. There is a fundamental difference between those two things that I think should be obvious to absolutely everybody, and the relative importance of a formal process where ministers of the UK government are attending and negotiating outcomes in devolved areas of responsibility are then not reported as a matter of course to the devolved administrations in the United Kingdom. To seek to compare that kind of process, which has not been working as it should, with how does one find out about the generality of negotiations, which is the talk of SW1, is the talk of Brussels, and is in the talk of the civil servants here in Edinburgh about the process that has been made. So, to Mr Bibby's point, there were no formal discussions that took place as part of the process, unfortunately, because Scotland is devolved and it is a United Kingdom government that negotiates as part of the UK's constitutional settlement on our behalf.
What about the informal discussions?
That we will. Sorry?
What about the informal discussions? Were the UK government aware of informal discussions the Scottish government?
The UK government and the Scottish government are aware, because it's custom and practice constantly for civil servants to speak to one another within the United Kingdom and with the European Union contacts. That's the way diplomatic relations work.
Can I just also ask, given we've heard about the Defence and Security Partnership arrangements, £150 billion €150 billion budget in that, should the Scottish Government now be reconsidering its position on using public funds to support defence sector jobs?
The Scottish Government does use public money in support of the defence sector. It's a very important part of our economy. We know that there's a live debate about how does one make sure that there is an ethical dimension to all of that. And there is a challenge involved in that. I'm sure Mr Bibby would recognise that, and that whilst I'm sure he and I would agree that it is important and necessary that we're able to help support one another in a European context and support neighbours in need, such as Ukraine, I think at the present time, when we have called, for example, for the United Kingdom to end all weapons supplies to Israel, that we have a challenge to make sure that the UK government listens to our views on issues like that, and that we have systems in place to be able to make sure that that actually happens. Going forward in relation to the European Union, I think it is of significant interest that the UK and UK defence sector is a part of that process. I think we all realise that having a multitude of different weapon systems and calibers and standards across our different armed forces, when we are, as we sadly see, seeing a common threat in Europe, is part of a wider reason why we need to make sure that we cooperate, and the Scottish Government is supportive of that, and we're supportive of having a defence sector here. And I would very much hope that some of the resources which are being marshalled in a European Union context, but further than that, I mean, there are other European Union countries that are investing significantly in defence. Germany, for example, has announced €500 billion in additional defence spending. I'm sure that's not all going to be spent in Germany. That Scotland will play its part, as will everywhere else in Europe.
Thank you.
Can I bring in Mr Azam, please?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I get very frustrated by this debate, and I get frustrated when we went to our visit to Brussels last year, and I get frustrated when I went down to London last week, because effectively When you were a member, you had influence and you could do something about it. You know, Brexit's a political equivalent of taking a baseball bat to your head for half an hour and hitting yourself with it, because effectively you're negotiating all the time. And I'm trying to bring an everyman view to this, because in the public in Scotland, their view is, when they look at this, is, well, surely we were better when we were in the European Union. Surely this is complete and utter madness that we find ourselves trying to renegotiate something we're already members of. And that's a frustrating issue for me. Like, you know, people talk about, when we go to Brussels, about Swiss, the Switzerland type deal. We've already been told by Brussels, nobody's getting a Swiss deal. That's it, that's off the table. So the only thing is to be a member. You know, is it not just the case that surely when we go through all this, it's not even a political argument, it's a sensible argument that being in the European Union was a lot better than the madness that is Brexit?
Absolutely. And what we're talking about here in terms of the UK-EU deal is what is on the margins of improving relations with the European Union. Yes, an SPS agreement would be a really good thing. Of course it would. Yes, being part of Erasmus again would be a good thing. Or having closer energy cooperation. We haven't had time to get onto that, Convener, this morning, but given how important our energy sector is, surely it makes a lot of sense to everybody that there is such a thing. These are the areas that the European Union is prepared to have improved relations, but far short of being a member state. Because if one could have all of the advantages of being in the European Union without having to deliver on the acquis communautaire and being part of the processes of being a member state, then the European Union wouldn't function. And everybody would just cherry-pick what they want and ignore the things that they don't want. It's not the way the European Union works. So, whilst I think it's right for the UK government to seek to get the best possible reset of arrangement and agreement that can be reached, yes, in defence and security, but in the wide range of other issues that we've talked about this morning, it's not the same as being a member state. And it's important to be reminded that that is the case, and Mr Adams is absolutely right in highlighting that.
Well, the thing is, when you look at even whatever deal they eventually come to, and it's constant negotiation, the time that goes into that as well, is the fact that, you know, we're not even getting a second best deal here. You know, it's third or fourth best by the time you get there. And someone who's been involved in negotiation and when you used to work in the real world, I just find it bizarre the way the UK has gone about this. And honestly, to me, it just feels like you're hitting yourself in the head with a baseball bat continually.
Mr Adam, that there are some statistics that illustrate his point. In economic terms, the UK government's own figures estimate that this deal will add £9 billion to the UK's national income by 2040. That is just 0.2% of GDP, and that has to be seen against the loss in GDP caused by Brexit, which is estimated to be 20 times that. That is 4% of GDP, and that estimate is by the Office of Budget Responsibility, that I'm sure all members realise is an organisation that is worth listening to. So it's very real. The point that Mr Adam is making is very real.
Thank you, Convener.
Your final questions, Cabinet Secretary. Please be brief, as we're due to finish shortly, and we have another agenda item in private. So, Mr Brown.
Yeah, I should say I enjoyed the light relief of hearing Brexiteers complaining about trying to deal with the EU because they were tough and all the rest of it. However, the question I was wanting to ask was, you made the point that the disaffection felt by the Scottish Government is shared by the Welsh Government and by the Northern Ireland Assembly, a Sinn Féin First Minister and so on. I should also say that we found the same disenchantment with the House of Lords last week when we were in Westminster, who felt they were ignored or not consulted on large parts of the agreement as well. My point is, at what point do we say to ourselves, this is not working? You know, continued requests, and I mean as much to do with the parliamentary scrutiny as it is to do with the IGR stuff. Do we say we're just demeaning ourselves, continually pleading to get a half-an-hour private kind of off-the-record chat with the occasional minister? At what point do we say we've reached the limits of devolution, there's got to be a better way to do business?
Well, I have made my views very clear to the UK government that I am at the end of the road in this process unless it changes. We cannot see significant agreements reached by the United Kingdom in areas of very important devolved responsibility and for the system to not work properly because the United Kingdom government chooses for it not to work properly. We are at the end of this. If this does not improve, there will not have been a reset, because what is happening is the same as what happened before under the last UK government. The cancellation of meetings are facts. The not sharing of documents or details are facts. The facts that we can learn more from the front page of the Financial Times or by speaking with diplomats of other countries are facts. That is not how we should be doing things, and this should matter to everybody on this committee of all parties, because there is zero defence for it. There is no defence for it. This is not an issue of two partners not wishing to use, not wishing to have the best of relations. We in Scotland, our colleagues in Wales, our colleagues in Northern Ireland are trying to make this work. And what happened as part of the UK-EU summit agreement process did not. And we will very, very soon be able to see by how the UK government acts in terms of its negotiating mandate and its interrelations with the Scottish Government, Welsh and Northern Irish governments on the detail that you've been asking me about on this committee today, either will be properly included, and that involves consultation and not just readouts of what they are negotiating on our behalf. We will see very soon whether indeed there has been an improvement or not, and I would be as interested as this committee to be able to see UK ministers answer these questions in public and in detail.
Final question.
Thank you, Convener. This is the committee that scrutinises the Scottish Government's actions in relation to intergovernmental relations. The agreement that the European Union and the UK say they made on the 19th of May must have been a huge agenda item on the 23rd of May, when the Council of the Nations and Regions met. That would be including John Swinney, the First Minister. Where are the minutes or the outcomes of that meeting that would give us some detail to scrutinise the Scottish Government's engagement with the UK Government to that meeting? Were the issues that you've protested about in this evidence session, were they on the agenda?
Yeah,
what was said? What was agreed between John Swinney and Keir Starmer? I'm sure it must have come up.
Yeah. So I am sure that it did come up. I didn't attend the meeting that Mr Kerr
have you seen the minutes?
I haven't seen the minutes of that, but I will I would be happy to update the committee.
Can we have a copy of the minutes?
As we know, the First Minister does give evidence to committees of this Parliament as well. So I think the question's best directed towards him. But I'd be happy to update you, Convener, and colleagues in due course.
I presume there are Scottish Government documents that pertain to the First Minister's engagement at that meeting. There must be.
So there are official records are taken of all official
so we
meetings.
Can have those, can we, to scrutinize what happens?
So I'll revert to the committee, Convener.
We can write and ask for them, Mr Kerr.
Well, let's do that then.
Okay,
but, I mean, I wouldn't want Mr Kerr to be under any illusions. The United Kingdom government is very, very, very well aware of the concerns that intergovernmental relations are not working properly.
But I want to know what was discussed about it and what resolutions or otherwise were reached between the First Minister and the Prime Minister.
You made your point, Mr Kerr.
Yeah.
I think so. We'll definitely get a letter sent on that. I'm going to draw the public session to a close now. We'll have a 5-minute comfort break and then take our final agenda item. Thank you for your attendance, Cabinet Secretary.